The widowed businessman's twin daughters were born paralyzed. But what the maid did shocked everyone. That afternoon, sunlight filtered through the trees in the backyard of Ethan Walker's large but lifeless home. Birds chirped, the wind whispered softly, everything seemed peaceful. Yet to Ethan, it was only an empty silence. He had finished an early meeting at his architecture firm and decided to come home unannounced. The black car rolled over the gravel path and stopped by the porch. As he stepped out, briefcase in hand, he froze. From the back garden came the faintest sound, a woman's gentle voice, followed by soft laughter and the fragile, trembling giggles of children. For 2 years, that sound had not existed in this house. He followed the path, and what he saw made him stop dead. On the dewy grass, Grace Miller, the new therapist he'd hired for his daughters, was kneeling, supporting the tiny arms of Ella and Lila. The twins, those same fragile girls doctors had called incurable, were standing. Their legs shook like thin reeds in the wind, but they were holding, balancing, alive. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He took a step closer, voice low and rough. "What are you doing, Grace?" Startled, she looked up. Her hazel eyes caught the sunlight, steady and calm. "Good afternoon, Mr. Walker," she said softly. "I'm helping them practice balance. Today's the first time they've stood for 15 seconds. He stared at the girls. "What did you just say?" His tone cracked. "Is this some kind of joke? The doctors were clear. They can't walk, can't stand. You know that." Grace adjusted her grip on the twins' arms, keeping them steady, and replied gently yet firmly, "I know what they said, but sometimes the impossible lives not in their bodies, but in what we choose to believe." Ethan inhaled sharply, jaw tight. He stepped closer, close enough to see the thin line of sweat on her forehead, the quiet determination in her smile. "Believe?" he said bitterly. "Every doctor, every specialist told me they'd never walk, never talk. You think you know more than them?" Grace lifted her gaze, voice steady and sure. "I don't know more. I just see what they don't. I've worked with special children for 8 years. I've seen cases worse than your daughters, and I've seen those children walk, speak, live, not because of miracles, but because someone gave them time, patience, and love." Her words hung heavy in the air. Ethan clenched his fists. "You had no right to do this without my permission." Grace didn't flinch. "And they have every right to a chance, Mr. Walker. They deserve at least one person willing to try." The wind stilled. Silence fell over the garden. Ethan looked down. Ella held a blade of grass, her small fingers trembling but gripping. Lila made a faint sound, unclear yet real. His throat tightened. How long had it been since he'd heard his daughters make a sound? How long had he let a diagnosis decide their future? And his. Grace slowly lowered the twins onto the grass, brushed her hands, then turned to him. "I don't expect you to believe me today," she said softly. "Just watch. Sometimes miracles begin with the smallest steps." Ethan said nothing. He only watched, the twins' flushed faces under the golden sun, their fingers clutching at the grass, and realized his heart, long dormant, was beating again. "Just watch?" he asked quietly. Grace smiled gently. "Yes, watch, and believe that good things can happen if we don't give up." He stood there in silence. The sunlight spilled across his face, blending with emotions he couldn't name. Neither of them knew that this quiet afternoon, in this very garden, would mark the beginning of a miracle, one that would change not only the lives of 2 little girls, but the man who had forgotten how to believe. Night fell quietly, wrapping the garden in a thin veil of mist. The warm light from the living room spilled through the glass, casting Ethan Walker's shadow long across the wooden floor. He stood there for a long time, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring into the darkness outside. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying echoes of something he had tried to forget, yet never could. That afternoon replayed in his mind again and again. Grace kneeling on the grass, holding Ella and Lila upright, the twins trembling in the sunlight, standing on the legs that doctors had sworn would never support them. He couldn't believe what he'd seen. If it was real, it meant he had been wrong for 2 years. Setting the glass down, Ethan walked down the hallway toward his daughter's room. The door was ajar, a soft golden glow seeping through. He paused, hearing Grace's low voice reading a bedtime story. Her tone was calm and rhythmic, occasionally broken by a weary sigh. He pushed the door gently open. Grace sat in the wooden chair by the bed, her brown hair falling over one shoulder, her face tired but peaceful. Ella and Lila lay quietly, eyes closed, faint smiles curling their lips. One of them still clutched Grace's finger, as if afraid she'd leave. Ethan froze at the doorway. How long had it been since he'd looked at them this way? 2 years, or maybe forever. Since the day Sarah died, he hadn't set foot in this room. She had chosen every color, every blanket, every picture on the wall. He remembered that day vividly. Sarah on the operating table, pale, lips dry, yet smiling at him. Her voice had been barely a whisper. "If anything happens, love them for me." 3 hours later, she was gone. Ethan stood in the hospital corridor, listening to the flatline tone, and felt his world collapse. From that moment, he built a wall. He didn't cry, didn't rage. He returned to work within weeks, drowning in blueprints and meetings. He hired nurses and doctors to care for the twins, convincing himself it was duty. But deep down, it was escape. Now, seeing Grace there with his daughters, her hand intertwined with theirs, the warm lamplight framing the three of them, it cracked something inside him. Grace looked up, smiled faintly, and whispered, "They've fallen asleep. It was a good day for them." He stepped closer, his gaze softening on the small, peaceful faces. "You really think they can walk?" Grace shook her head gently. "I don't think, Ethan. I believe. Belief doesn't replace science, but sometimes it reminds the body how to live." He sighed, voice heavy. "You don't understand. They told me it was impossible. They told me to accept reality." Grace turned to him, her eyes calm but bright. "Reality can change. I've seen it. I've seen children who couldn't even sit one day laugh the next, call for their mothers. Science defines limits, but people often rise beyond them." Silence filled the room, broken only by the soft ticking of the clock and the twins' steady breaths. Grace set the book aside, tucked the blanket around Lila, and murmured, "Today." Ella turned her head when I called her name, and Lila laughed. A real laugh, not a reflex. Ethan looked at her, stunned. "Laughed?" "Yes," Grace smiled. "She laughed when I sang." And Ella reached for the light. "These are small things, but they mean more than any diagnosis ever could." The words hit him deep. Suddenly, every report, every cold statement from doctors felt fragile, uncertain. He looked at his daughters, the girls he thought were lost, and for the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, everyone had been wrong. Grace rose to her feet, her voice steady but gentle. "I can't promise miracles, Ethan, but I can promise I won't give up." I'll teach them how to feel the world again. And if you allow me, I want you to be part of that journey." He stared at her, seeing in her eyes not just kindness, but faith. Faith strong enough to shake his fear. He nodded slightly, almost to himself. "All right, I'll watch." Grace smiled, a soft, warming smile that melted something frozen inside him. She gave a small nod, then quietly left the room. Ethan stayed, alone in the lamplight. He bent down, placing a hand on the blanket. One of the girls stirred, her lips moving as if whispering in a dream, and for a moment, he thought he heard a sound, faint and fragile, but real. He felt his chest tremble. The wall he'd built around his heart was cracking, and through that crack, something slipped in, small, delicate, but bright. Hope. That night, Ethan barely slept. He lay awake, listening to the whisper of wind brushing against the eaves, the faint tap of leaves on glass. Grace's words echoed in his mind, simple yet haunting. Belief can help the body remember how to live. By the time dawn crept in, he was already awake. The soft sound of laughter came from the living room. He followed it and stopped in the doorway. Grace sat on the rug surrounded by colorful toys. Wooden blocks, rubber balls, soft rings. Ella and Lila lay on their stomachs, heads wobbling as they tried to lift them. Grace supported their backs, her voice calm and encouraging. "Good, Ella, just a little more. That's it, Lila, you're doing so well." Ethan stood still, mesmerized. The air in the house no longer felt heavy. Sunlight spilled across the floor, lighting the girls' flushed faces as they struggled and giggled. A sudden short laugh escaped Lila's lips, faint but real. Grace turned and smiled when she saw him. "You're up earlier than I expected." He walked closer, his voice low. "I heard them." Grace nodded without looking away from the twins. Sound is vital. When a child hears a familiar voice, it triggers emotional pathways. Neurons begin reconnecting, rebuilding what was lost. Ethan frowned slightly, listening. Grace glanced at him, eyes glowing with quiet conviction. The brain is remarkable, especially in children. It can rewire itself. And the most powerful catalyst isn't medicine or machines. It's love. When a child feels loved, the brain literally grows new connections. He watched his daughters, tiny bodies trembling, eyes bright under the morning light, and something stirred inside him, sharp yet warm. "So, what do you want me to do?" Grace wiped her forehead and smiled. "Today, we start with something simple. You're going to learn how to touch." He hesitated. "Touch?" "Yes. Gentle massage stimulates the nerves, helps circulation, but more than that, it creates trust. Start with Ella." She guided his hands, her touch steady and warm. He followed awkwardly at first, his fingers stiff, but then he relaxed. Under his hands, Ella shifted, releasing a faint sound. Not a cry, a soft "ah," fragile but unmistakably hers. Ethan froze, eyes wide. Grace's smile deepened. "That's a good sign. She's responding to safety, to your presence." His heart pounded. He kept going, stroking her back gently, and Ella let out another sound, clearer, followed by a tiny, trembling smile. She's smiling," he whispered. Grace met his eyes, her voice tender. "Yes, because she knows her father is here." The words hit him like a wave. For 2 years, he had been absent, physically present, but emotionally gone. And now, with his own hands, he had done what doctors never could, made his daughter smile. Grace showed him the next step with Lila, bending and extending her arms, touching her palms, rubbing her tiny feet. Each movement, Each word he spoke, "Good job, Daddy's here," seemed to awaken something inside her. Lila turned toward his voice, her dark eyes bright with awareness. "She's looking at me," Ethan gasped. "Grace, she's actually looking at me." Grace laughed softly. "I told you, when you speak with real emotion, the brain recognizes it faster than any sound. That's instinct." He couldn't stop staring at his daughters. His hands trembled, but not from fear, from awe. "I never imagined something as simple as touch could do this." Grace shook her head. "It's not just touch, it's connection. The bond between a parent and child is the strongest medicine there is. I can teach them therapy, but only you can be the reason they fight to live." He fell silent, gazing at the two small bodies on the blanket, their tiny fingers wrapped around his. Sarah's voice echoed in his memory. "Love them for me." He hadn't, not until now, but he finally understood. Love wasn't pity, it was presence, action, being here fully every single day. He looked up at Grace, her eyes alight with quiet faith. "Teach me everything, Grace. I want to do my part." She smiled, soft and steady. "Then today, we truly begin. And remember, Ethan, belief isn't just emotion. It's part of the treatment." He nodded, voice firm, calm. "I understand, and I believe." Outside, the sunlight grew stronger, spilling across the floor where the twins lay, their small hands reaching toward the air. Their laughter mingled with the birdsong, and for the first time in 2 years, the house was truly alive again. In the days that followed, Ethan Walker's house began to change. Each morning, sunlight streamed through the windows to the sound of soft laughter, toys rolling across the floor, and Grace's calm, rhythmic voice leading small exercises. The once cold mansion was alive again. Every breath, every giggle, every sound, a reminder that life had returned. Grace transformed the living room into a temporary therapy space. A thick rug lay at the center, bathed in natural light. On the walls, she pinned colorful charts, animal pictures, and hand-cut letters. When Ethan asked, she simply smiled. Children need colors, images, sounds. Every time they see, hear, or touch, their brains learn. He began spending mornings with them. He learned to speak to his daughters, not out of pity, but as a father. At first he was awkward, unsure, but when Ella babbled a faint "ah" and Lila smiled at him, his fear started to fade. He sat beside them, reading stories, singing along with Grace, and every time they laughed, something inside him mended. One morning, as Grace guided an arm-stretching exercise, Ethan sat behind Ella, his hand on her back, steadying her breathing. Grace said softly, "Let your hand feel her movement. Believe her body can respond to you." He followed, slow, deliberate, his breath syncing with hers. Ella shifted, just slightly, but enough for him to feel it. For a moment, time froze. All he could hear was the rhythm of his heartbeat and the warmth of the small body beneath his hand. Grace smiled from the side. "See? When you believe, she does too. That connection is stronger than any medicine." Ethan looked up. "You always believe it's possible?" "Always," she said. "I've failed many times, but every time a child holds my hand, I remember. Belief is something we can't afford to lose." Her words carved themselves into his mind. That afternoon, while Grace prepared lunch, Ethan stayed with the girls. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, soft and golden. He held Ella's tiny hand, warmth spreading through him. He thought of Sarah, her voice, her laughter. She once told him, "I believe love can outlive loss." He hadn't understood then. Now he did. Without thinking, he began to sing, a lullaby Sarah used to hum. His voice was rough at first, trembling but grew steadier. Ella stirred, clutching his finger. Lila made a faint ah, long and clear. He stopped, stunned. Grace returned, a tray of food in her hands, pausing at the doorway. A quiet smile crossed her face. "You did something extraordinary today, Ethan." "I was just singing." "No," she said gently. "You gave them what they've needed most. The sound of their father's voice. You taught them love." He lowered his head, his lips trembling. Tears glistened in the light. The following days fell into rhythm. Morning massage, midday movement, evening music, and sensory play. Grace explained neural reflexes, sensory triggers, the science of emotional learning. Ethan listened like a devoted student, absorbing every word. He wasn't learning to master therapy. He was learning to be there. Each day brought small miracles. Ella reached toward bright colors. Lila turned her head at the sound of a bell. And one morning, when he bent to kiss Ella's forehead, she made a sound that shattered him completely. "Da! Da!" Time stopped. Ethan froze, his heart pounding wildly. Grace's eyes shimmered with emotion. "You heard it, didn't you?" she whispered. "She called you." He dropped to his knees, gathering Ella into his arms. Tears spilled freely. "Papa's here, Ella. Papa's right here." Grace watched, her eyes wet but glowing. It wasn't just a child's first word. It was a father's rebirth. That evening, as the sun sank over the garden, Ethan carried the twins onto the porch. The air smelled faintly of lavender. He looked at them and smiled, then turned to Grace. "I thought my life ended with Sarah, but maybe the best part is just beginning." Grace's voice was soft as the wind. "Sometimes, it's the broken hearts that let the light in." He met her gaze, and for the first time in 2 years, warmth spread through him. A small flame had been lit, quiet, steady, growing brighter with every breath. It was the flame of a father learning to believe, to love, and to begin again. That night, after a long therapy session, the twins fell asleep earlier than usual. The house was quiet, the soft glow of the lamps painting warm patches on the walls. Grace was tidying the rug in the living room when she heard slow footsteps. Ethan emerged from the twins' room, his shirt still scented faintly of lavender. He looked tired, yet lighter. Something inside him had shifted. "They're asleep?" Grace asked softly. He nodded with a small smile. "Both of them. They laughed a lot today." She caught the warmth in his tone, something she hadn't heard before. Ethan sat on the sofa, elbows on his knees, silent for a while. Grace waited patiently. "Grace," he began suddenly, "do you ever get afraid?" She blinked. "Afraid of what?" "Of hope," he said quietly. "Afraid that if you believe too much, it'll all fall apart." Grace was silent for a moment before answering. "Yes, many times. But I realized fear never saves anyone. Only hope keeps us moving, even when we stumble." Ethan stared into the glass of water on the table, voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, my wife, she used to say that too." Grace sat down across from him, her eyes softening. Ethan took a slow breath, gathering himself. "We met in college. She studied art. I studied architecture. Sarah saw the world differently. She believed everything had a soul, the wall, the tree, even a crack in the floor. They all have stories, she'd say. He smiled faintly, lost in the memory. I loved her for that." He paused, hands tightening. "During pregnancy, she got weaker. The doctors warned us. Twins were risky. She knew, but she wanted both of them. She said even if she had to give something up, she wanted to leave something beautiful behind. I begged her to choose safety. She just smiled. And that day, his voice broke. She held my hand and said, "If anything happens, love them for me." I never got to answer. Silence filled the room. Grace didn't interrupt. She simply listened, eyes glistening. When the doctors told me about the twins' condition, I felt hollow. He continued. I blamed the world, fate, even them. I couldn't stand looking at their faces. They looked too much like her, so I buried myself in work, convinced that time would numb it all. But it didn't. It just made me fade away. He gave a bitter laugh, a fragile sound. And then you came along, with your strange ideas and that calm smile I couldn't stand. I hated how much you believed, how unshaken you were, because it made me see what I wasn't. But today, he looked up, meeting her eyes. Today, I understand. You're not naive. You're braver than anyone I've ever known. Grace smiled gently. I'm just doing my job, Ethan. No. He shook his head. You're doing more. You reminded me that a part of Sarah still lives here. In them. And if I keep running, I'll lose the last thing she left me. Grace's gaze lingered on him. In the soft light, his face no longer looked frozen by grief, but alive, fragile, human. She must have been an incredible woman, Grace murmured. Ethan nodded, eyes glistening. She was my light, and maybe she sent you here. Grace laughed softly, though there was a tremor in her voice. If that's true, then it's an honor. They sat in silence. The only sound, the ticking clock and the soft crackle of the fire. It was a silence full of understanding. After a moment, Grace stood, adjusting the blanket on the chair. It's late. You should rest. We have an early session tomorrow. Ethan hesitated, then said quietly, Would you stay for tea? She paused, then nodded. He made tea carefully, the scent of mint filling the air. They sat across from each other, not speaking. Their eyes met occasionally, peaceful, unguarded. Outside, the wind brushed through the lavender, carrying its faint sweetness into the house. Ethan looked out the window, where moonlight fell across the grass where his daughters had once stood. He realized that no matter how painful the past had been, he didn't want to run anymore, because now, in this house once filled with loss, he had found warmth again. In two little girls, and in the quiet, steady woman who had refused to give up on them. That night, the past stopped being a chain. It became a reminder that love, no matter how buried, always finds its way home. Since that night, Ethan's house no longer felt like a tomb of silence and grief. It had changed, slowly, but unmistakably. Morning light now flooded through the windows once kept closed for years. Laughter, songs, and the tiny rhythm of two pairs of feet filled the rooms. Grace woke earlier than usual. She loved the brief moment when the sun rose over the line of trees, painting the wooden floor with gold. She laid out the therapy mats, brewed a pot of herbal tea, prepared bottles for the girls. Sometimes, Ethan was already there, sitting by the window, gazing at the garden where everything began. "Good morning, Grace," he said, his voice calm, lighter than before. "Good morning, Ethan. Did you sleep well?" "For the first time in a long time, yes." She smiled. "Then we're both improving." They laughed. Their laughter blended with the light, easy and natural, as if it had always belonged there. Therapy sessions now felt more like play. Ethan grew steady, gentle, patient. When Grace guided him through the movements, he followed carefully. When she sang, he joined in, off-key but full of warmth. Ella and Lila sensed the change. They smiled more, followed his voice, and every touch brought stronger reactions. One morning, the four of them were in the backyard. Grace showed Ethan how to help the twins stand with support bars. He held the frame. She steadied the girl's hands. Sunlight spilled over her brown hair, beads of sweat glimmering on her forehead. Yet her smile was steady, bright. "Easy," she said. "Let them find balance themselves." He obeyed. Ella wobbled, then took half a step, then another. A short burst of laughter escaped her lips, and Ethan froze. "You did it, sweetheart," he whispered, voice trembling. Grace smiled at him, pride and tenderness in her gaze, along with something deeper. From that day, Ethan never missed a session. He rearranged his schedule to stay home every morning. The living room overflowed with colors, toys, pillows, drawings, even crayon marks on the walls Grace insisted on keeping. "They're signs of life," she said. He often found himself watching her quietly. The way she sang to the girls, her hair catching the afternoon light, the calm patience in her face. Sometimes he just stood at the doorway, feeling a strange warmth spread through him, something both new and achingly familiar. One night, after the twins had fallen asleep, Grace sat reading on the sofa. Ethan walked in carrying 2 cups of tea. "I might have brewed it a little strong, but I hope you don't mind." "I like it strong," she said, accepting the cup. Their fingers brushed, just for a second, but it was enough. They talked for hours, about her work, the children she'd helped, the buildings he'd designed. The conversation flowed naturally, effortless. "Don't you ever get tired?" he asked. "All day teaching, playing, caring for them?" "Of course," she said with a small laugh. "But it's the kind of tired that makes you want to wake up earlier the next morning." He looked at her for a long time. "I owe you more than you know." Grace shook her head, voice barely above a whisper. "You don't owe me anything, Ethan. You're just being the father they always needed." Her words struck something deep inside him, like air feeding a flame. From that day forward, Ethan became fully part of their rhythm. He changed diapers, cooked porridge, sang lullabies. When one of the girls fell sick, he stayed up through the night with Grace. In those long, quiet hours, under the dim light and the twins' fragile breaths, they often sat side by side without speaking. Their silence felt like understanding. One chilly autumn evening, Ethan walked into the living room and found Grace asleep on the sofa, a book open across her lap. Her hair was loose, her face peaceful. He took a blanket, gently draped it over her, then hesitated. His hand brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. In that moment, he realized what he'd been avoiding all along, that this house had come alive not just because of the children's laughter, but because of her. She had given him what he thought he'd lost forever: faith, warmth, and the courage to love again. Outside, the wind stirred the lavender garden, carrying its familiar scent through the open window. Ethan smiled softly, feeling at last that he was truly home. That night, after Ethan had quietly covered Grace with a blanket as she slept on the sofa, he didn't sleep at all. He sat by the window, the moonlight spilling across the garden, the same garden where the first miracle had happened. Something inside him was changing, quietly but deeply, like a flame rekindling from ashes. By morning, the house was awake again, and so was he. The rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet lavender. the world washed clean. Grace opened the windows wide, letting sunlight pour in. The twins sat on the rug with colorful blocks, their laughter like tiny bells. Ethan came out of the kitchen, hair slightly tousled, a smile lingering on his face. "You look brighter today," Grace teased. "Maybe it's the first good night's sleep I've had in years," he replied, raising his coffee mug. The air between them felt warm, alive. Grace shook a small silver bell. Its clear tone danced through the room. Ella turned her head, reaching for the sound, giggling. "Shall we try the sound exercise?" Grace asked. Ethan nodded, kneeling in front of the twins. He looked into their eyes, so round, so bright, and said softly, "Ella, can you hear Daddy?" The little girl blinked. Her lips trembled. Grace froze, holding her breath. Ethan leaned closer, voice barely more than a whisper. "Daddy's here, sweetheart." Then it came, so faint, it could have been the wind. "Duh!" Ethan stopped breathing. Grace's eyes widened, then again, clearer this time, trembling but real. "Duh! Duh!" The world seemed to stand still. Ella smiled, proud of the sound she had made. Ethan's voice cracked. "Grace, did you hear that? She called me." Grace nodded, tears spilling over. "I heard it, Ethan. She really called you." He knelt down, pulling Ella into his arms. The child laughed, her tiny hands patting his cheeks as if to confirm it was real. Ethan held her tight, sobbing and laughing all at once. "Daddy's here, baby. Daddy's here." Grace stood motionless, one hand over her mouth, her own tears falling freely. What she saw wasn't medicine. It was love, raw and boundless. Then Ethan looked up at her. Their eyes met, full of joy, gratitude, and something else, something fierce and human. He rose, crossed the space between them, and before either could think, he pulled her into his arms. She gasped softly, and then his lips found hers. It wasn't planned, nor perfect. It was desperate, trembling, real. When they broke apart, both breathless, their eyes locked in astonishment. Two souls caught between joy and fear, unsure what had just begun. "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered, voice shaking. "I didn't mean to." Grace shook her head. "Don't be. I understand." They said nothing more. The twins' laughter filled the silence, reminding them that the world was still turning. That evening, under the amber glow of lamps, Grace sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching mist rise from the garden. Ethan joined her quietly. For a while, they didn't speak. Then he said softly, "I lost Sarah, and for 2 years, I thought I'd never feel anything again, but today, I realized my heart still knows how to beat because of you." Grace turned toward him, her voice trembling. "Ethan, I feel it too, but I'm scared. If I let these feelings grow, I might lose focus. I don't want to risk what we've built for the girls." He nodded slowly. "I understand. I won't make things harder. I just wanted you to know you changed our lives." She lowered her gaze, her voice barely audible. "Then let's let it be, Ethan. If it's real, it will find the right time." They sat in silence, side by side. The moon rose, silver light spilling across the quiet garden where the children slept. Ethan looked up, whispering to the night, "Sarah, can you see? Our daughter called me today, and my heart, it's learning to love again." Grace heard him but didn't speak. She simply looked at him, the moon reflected in her eyes, filled with tenderness, faith, and a quiet promise. She would stay until this miracle was complete. After that night, something between Ethan and Grace shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Every glance, every silence, every brush of movement seemed to carry a quiet tension neither dared to name. They both knew they were standing on a thin line between restraint and feeling. Days passed, filled with the laughter of the twins. Ella and Lila were improving fast. They turned toward their father's voice now, their tiny eyes following him with recognition. Grace kept her calm, professional exterior, but whenever she caught Ethan's gaze lingering a second too long, her heartbeat stumbled, like a melody rediscovered. One lazy weekend afternoon, after the girls had fallen asleep, Ethan invited Grace out to the garden for tea. Sunlight streamed through the vines, warm and golden. They sat beneath the grape arbor, surrounded by rustling leaves and the scent of lavender. "I used to think I was a terrible father," Ethan began quietly. "When Sarah died, I didn't know what to do. I avoided the girls, because every time I looked at them, I saw that day. I hid behind work, behind blueprints, numbers, anything that didn't breathe." Grace listened, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. He continued, "But then you came. You taught me that being a father isn't about being perfect. It's about being there, even when it's messy or hard. Now all I want is to truly be their dad." "You're already doing that," she said softly, "and I think Sarah would be proud of you." He inhaled deeply, steadying himself, then asked, "What about you, Grace? Why did you choose this path? Working with special needs kids can't be easy." She smiled faintly, her voice carrying a hint of something far away. "I grew up in a foster home in Oregon. I never knew my parents. When I was little, I fell and hurt my spine. I couldn't walk for almost a year. There was a therapist named Mary. She didn't just help me walk again. She taught me to believe I could do more than people said I could. I guess I chose this job to give that same hope back." Ethan looked at her in silence, the late sunlight catching in her hair. In that moment, he saw her not as an employee, but as someone who had known pain and learned to build light out of it. And suddenly, everything about her made sense. The patience, the empathy, the way she looked at his daughters as if they were her own. "You're stronger than you realize, Grace," he said quietly. "That's what makes people believe in good things again." She laughed softly. "I'm not strong, Ethan. I just didn't have any other choice but to keep going." He fell silent. Between them stretched a comfortable quiet, the kind that exists only between people who no longer feel the need to fill it. That evening, after putting the twins to bed, Ethan stood at the doorway of the living room, watching Grace tidy up the toys. After a long pause, he said, "Grace, I've been thinking, I want you to stay. Not for a few months, really stay. Here with us." She froze. "Stay? You mean, live here?" He nodded. "You know what's best for Ella and Lila, but I'll only agree if I'm part of it too. I want you to promise me one thing. You won't do this alone. I'll be there for every session, every day." Grace studied him, the soft light of the lamp tracing his features. Steady, sincere, kind. "Are you serious?" she asked. "I've never been more serious." A slow smile spread across her lips. "All right, Ethan. I'll stay. But on one condition." He tilted his head. "Which is?" "That you don't just show up. You truly be there. Not out of duty, but with your heart." He stepped closer, his voice firm but gentle. "I promise, Grace. From now on, I'll never stand outside their lives again." She nodded, her smile deepening. No more words were needed. In that quiet moment, Something solid formed between them. Not romance, not yet, but a foundation stronger than either had expected. Outside, the night breeze drifted through the lavender garden. In the little house glowing softly behind them, a promise had been made. Simple, but enough to change everything. 3 months had passed since that night when Ethan and Grace made their promise. Time moved slowly inside the little house, every breath and every laugh marking a quiet rebirth. Ethan now woke earlier than Grace. He was no longer the man who hid behind silence and blueprints. Now he folded blankets, made bottles, prepared the exercises Grace had neatly written on the board. Once, she laughed and told him he was the most serious massage student she'd ever met. He smiled and said, "I'm just learning how to love with my hands." The twins had changed completely. Ella and Lila were stronger, their legs steadier, their eyes brighter. Every time Grace entered the room, they squealed in delight and turned toward their father as if to say, "Look what I can do." Ethan would kneel, catch them in his arms, and laughter would fill the house again. One crisp autumn morning, Grace decided to hold their session outdoors. The garden had been tidied. A rug lay on the grass, a few wooden chairs around. Ethan brought out Sarah's old radio, playing a soft tune that mingled with birdsong. "All right, Ella, Lila," Grace said cheerfully. "Today we try 2 steps." Ethan knelt beside the girls, holding the support frame. He glanced at Grace, smiling. "Ready?" "Always, Dad, Ethan," she teased, and he laughed. Ella wobbled, then took 1 step, then another. Grace and Ethan shouted in unison. Ella giggled and fell into his arms. Ethan lifted her high, spinning her around as laughter rippled through the yard. Lila clapped. Grace watched, her eyes glistening. Her chup. In that moment, she knew. Miracles weren't born from medicine, but from love healed enough to heal others. Later, when the twins napped, they sat on the porch with coffee in hand. The sunset painted everything in gold. Ethan looked down at his hands, hands that once trembled, now strong and warm. "I used to think I'd never be a real father," he said. "But seeing Ella walk today, I realized I was wrong. I just needed to begin." Grace smiled. "Maybe being a parent isn't something you're good at right away. Maybe it's something you learn, just like I learned to believe in people like you." He turned to her, eyes steady. "Grace, I don't know what the future holds, but there's one thing I do know. I don't want this house without you." She looked at him, her smile trembling. "Are you asking me to stay forever?" "I wouldn't dare use that word," he said softly. "But I want you here, not just as the person helping my daughters walk, but the one helping us all move forward." Her heart fluttered. She didn't answer right away, only looked out at the lavender swaying in the fading light. "Ethan," she whispered, "I never thought I'd have a family. I've always been the one helping others find their happiness, but here, with you and the girls, I finally feel like I belong somewhere." He reached out, gently laying his hand over hers. She hesitated, then let their fingers intertwine. Their hands fit together easily, naturally, as if they had always been meant to meet. From inside, faint laughter drifted through the open window. Maybe the girls were dreaming. Ethan and Grace smiled at the sound. The moment was quiet, golden, complete. The night came slowly. Moonlight spilled again through the same window where it once illuminated loneliness. Now it shone on something different. 2 sleeping children, and 2 people who had found, at last, not perfection, but peace. Ever since the day Ella took her first steps, the house had been full of life. Laughter spilled through the rooms. Sunlight danced across open windows, and the scent of lavender mingled with fresh bread in the mornings. Ethan and Grace had built a rhythm, simple, steady, and warm. But even the sweetest song has a note that falters. That note arrived one late autumn afternoon when Grace received a letter. She was tidying the living room when the mailman knocked. The envelope bore the seal of the Portland Neurological Rehabilitation Institute, the same one she'd applied to months ago. She opened it quietly, her eyes catching on the last line. "We are pleased to offer you the position of senior therapist, beginning next month." Her hands trembled. The light from the window fell across her face, highlighting the sudden shadow in her expression. When Ethan entered, she quickly folded the letter. "Mail from home?" he asked lightly. "Just work," she said, forcing a small smile. He didn't press, but that night, the letter's weight pressed hard on her heart. She couldn't sleep. She sat outside on the porch, watching the garden fade into mist. The door opened softly behind her. Ethan stepped out, sweater draped over his shoulders. "Couldn't sleep?" "I have some things to think about," she murmured. He sat beside her, silent for a long time. "Can I guess?" he said finally. "It's about the job offer, isn't it?" She turned sharply. "How did you—" "I saw the institute's name on the envelope," he said, smiling faintly. Grace exhaled. "They offered me a senior position. It's everything I've worked for. At least it was before here." "And now?" His voice was calm, but the sadness underneath was unmistakable. "I don't know," she whispered. "Here I feel part of something real. But that job, it's what I've dreamed of. I'm afraid if I stay, I'll lose who I'm supposed to be. But if I leave, I'll lose something I don't think I can replace." Ethan looked at her, the moonlight catching her features, strong yet so fragile. He wanted to say, "Don't go," but love, real love, doesn't cage. "Grace," he said finally, his voice unsteady, "I won't stop you. I just want you to know, no matter where you go, this will always be home. Not because the girls need you, because I do." Grace turned away, fighting the tears burning her eyes. "Don't say that, Ethan. You're making it harder." "I'm not trying to," he said softly. "You brought me back to life. I won't ever forget that, whether you stay or not." The wind stirred the curtains. Grace clutched the letter tighter, torn between duty and desire. She thought of the children she'd helped before, the hopeful faces that had once looked to her for strength. But then she saw, through the window, Ella and Lila asleep, hands clasped together, breathing softly. And she knew she had never felt this attached to anyone before. "If I leave," she whispered, "will you hate me?" He shook his head. "I could never hate the person who taught me how to believe again." Her voice broke. "I don't want to go, Ethan, but I can't betray the path that made me who I am." He gave a sad, gentle smile. "Then promise me one thing. Wherever you go, believe this. Here you will always be waited for." Grace nodded, standing slowly. "Thank you, Ethan." They stood together in silence, watching the garden shimmer under the pale moon. Drops of dew sparkled on the lavender like tears the night itself was trying to hide. From inside came the soft murmur of sleepy voices. Two little girls whispering through dreams. "Dada! Grace!" They both turned toward the sound, eyes meeting. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Some wounds can't be healed by medicine, only by love. And sometimes, love asks us to leave, so that we can learn the way back home. The morning Grace left, the sky was pale gray. A thin winter wind brushed through the bare trees. The house, once filled with laughter, now held a silence that felt too heavy to bear. A small suitcase stood neatly beside the couch, so orderly it broke Ethan's heart. Grace stood by the window, hands clasped tight. She had packed the night before, yet now every object seemed to breathe memories. The blanket she'd tucked around Lila, the towel she'd used for Ella, the porcelain mug Ethan had broken and clumsily glued back together. Each one seemed to whisper, "Are you really leaving?" Ethan came down the stairs slowly, each step deliberate. He stopped and looked at her, the woman who had walked into his life with gentleness and was now leaving in silence. "I had the car brought around," he said quietly. "The roads are slick today. Drive safe." Grace nodded, voice trembling. "Thank you, Ethan." He said nothing more. The silence stretched, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Then the twins ran in, clutching their stuffed bears. "Grace, where are you going?" Ella chirped. Grace knelt, gathering them in her arms. "I have to work for a little while, my loves, but I'll come back. I promise." Lila looked up, eyes glistening. "Soon?" "Yes, soon," Grace whispered, smiling through the ache. She kissed their foreheads, breathing in the scent of their hair, memorizing it. Ethan stood a few feet away, his hands gripping the railing. Every hug, every kiss felt like a blade drawn across his chest. He wanted to say, "Don't go," but he saw in her eyes a life calling beyond these walls. Love, real love, sometimes means letting go. She turned to him at last. "I left detailed notes for the next 3 months' exercises," she said, steadying her voice. "If you need anything, call me." "I'll manage," he said, then added softly, "I'm not sure I'll get used to the quiet, though." Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she said gently, "You and the girls taught me that family isn't where you're born. It's where your heart decides to stay. I'll carry this place with me always." He took a slow step closer, his eyes bright with tears. "I don't know if I should say this, but I need to. Grace, I love you." Grace froze. She'd imagined hearing those words 100 times, yet now they cracked something open inside her. She shook her head, tears spilling down. "Don't say it today, Ethan. If you do, I won't be able to walk away." He nodded, voice barely a whisper. "Then I won't. But you already know." She smiled faintly through tears. "I know." Outside, the taxi waited. The twins ran to the door, waving. "Bye-bye, Grace." She walked toward them, the suitcase wheels whispering against the floor. At the threshold, she turned one last time. Ethan stood by the window, one hand resting on the frame, his face half in shadow, half in light. The image burned into her memory. "Goodbye, Ethan," she said softly. "No," he replied. "Goodbye is for endings. I'll wait for the day you come home." She turned quickly, before her heart could betray her. The car pulled away. The iron gate closed with a metallic clang that echoed like a full stop at the end of a sentence. Ethan watched until the car disappeared down the foggy road. The scent of lavender drifted faintly in the cold wind. He closed his eyes, almost hearing her laughter, feeling her touch guiding his daughter's first steps. The emptiness pressed against his chest, yet within it, a quiet certainty bloomed. Grace had left more than memories. She had left the warmth of life itself. Inside, the twins sat by the window, staring at the empty yard. "Grace will come back, right?" Ella whispered. Lila nodded. She promised. Ethan heard them, knelt down and wrapped them both in his arms. "Yes," he said softly. "She always keeps her promises." They smiled, resting their heads on his shoulders. Ethan looked out through the window at the swaying lavender and whispered into the wind, "See you again, Grace. When the air smells like lavender again, I'll know you're on your way home." Winter came and went. Then spring returned, carrying soft rain and the scent of wet earth. Since the day Grace left, the house had changed, quieter but no longer heavy. Ethan kept his promise. Every morning, he rose early, made bottles, turned on soft music, and worked through therapy with the twins. Ella could now stand on her own. Lila had begun forming short sentences. Each time they called, "Dada!" his heart clenched, with pride and with an ache for the gentle voice once joining in. On the wooden board still hanging in the living room, Grace's schedule remained untouched. He never erased it. Instead, he wrote new notes beneath, as if still reporting silently to her. Sometimes, during practice, he caught himself whispering, "Look, Grace, she did it." Then he would fall quiet and smile faintly, eyes full of quiet fire. 3 months passed, then 6. Long enough for pain to dull, but not enough to fade. One early summer morning, Ethan received a letter with no sender's name, just 2 words, from Portland. Inside, in familiar handwriting, were a few simple lines. "I'm doing well. The work here is meaningful, but not a day passes that I don't think of you and the girls. If you can, come to the neuro-rehabilitation conference next week. I'll be speaking. Maybe it's time we meet again, not to remember, but to continue. Grace." His heart stumbled. He read it again and again, hearing her voice in every word. And the next week, he went. The conference was held in Portland, in a white building overlooking the Willamette River. Ethan brought the twins. He couldn't bear to leave them, and deep down, he wanted them to see the woman who had changed their lives. The hall was full. Ethan sat in the 4th row, the twins perched on his knees, eyes wide. When the host announced, "Please welcome Grace Miller," Ethan's heartbeat quickened painfully. Grace stepped onto the stage in her white coat, hair tied back, calm and radiant. Her voice filled the room. "I once believed recovery came only from medicine, but I've learned that sometimes healing doesn't start in the hands. It starts in the heart." Her eyes swept across the crowd and stopped. There they were, Ella waving, smiling, Ethan watching her in silence, his gaze full of all the days he had waited. Grace inhaled sharply. Her voice faltered for a second, then steadied. But something in her eyes had changed, softer, warmer. Every word she spoke after that carried a quiet tremor of emotion. When the talk ended, she stepped into the hallway, heart racing. And then a voice came from behind her, the voice she had heard in dreams. "Miss Miller, that was incredible." She turned. Ethan stood there, holding the girl's hands. His shirt was pale blue, his smile gentle, his eyes steady and kind. The same man, yet somehow new, stronger, lighter, whole. "You really came," she whispered. "I didn't think you'd travel all this way just to hear me talk." "I came to keep a promise," he said. "You said we should meet again, to continue. I'm here to continue." Grace bent down, tears filling her eyes as the girls ran to her. "Grace!" Ella cried. "Look, I can walk!" Grace gasped, then burst into tears, watching the little girl take a few wobbly steps before collapsing into her arms. She held them close, trembling, laughing, and crying at once. Ethan's voice softened. "I followed every note you left, but there's one thing I couldn't do. Forget you." She looked up, smiling through tears. "Maybe I couldn't either. I thought I left to find myself. But it turns out, I belonged to where I left. He stepped forward, extending his hand. She met his eyes, and without a word, placed her hand in his, like there had never been an absence at all. Outside, sunlight shimmered over the river. A breeze carried the faint scent of lavender from the garden nearby. And in that moment, both knew. Sometimes you have to leave not to forget, but to understand that the place you left was always home. That afternoon, after the conference, Grace walked out of the building with Ella and Lila's hands in hers. Ethan walked beside them in silence. Sunlight spilled across the river, turning the air gold. No one spoke. Only laughter, soft and clear, floated between them. That evening, they sat in a small cafe by the river. Grace talked about her work at the Institute, the children she helped, the progress she'd seen. Ethan listened, eyes never leaving her face. When she paused, he asked quietly, "Grace, you once said we should meet again to continue. I need to know, continue to where?" She smiled, the lamplight glinting in her brown eyes. "Maybe to continue believing, to continue healing, to continue loving." The word loving slipped out softly, but it struck deep. Ethan said nothing more. Some truths are heard not with the ears, but with the heart. 3 months later, Grace came back, not as a visitor, but as someone returning home. The twins ran to the gate shouting, "Grace is back!" The house seemed to brighten as she stepped inside. Lavender scented the air again. And there was Ethan by the kitchen counter, holding a coffee pot, smiling the same warm smile she'd missed every day. From then on, they began building something greater. The Hope Valley Rehabilitation Center, a place for children like Ella and Lila. Ethan handled design and logistics. Grace led therapy. They worked long hours, but joy filled every corner. Each child's laugh, every tiny step forward felt like a new beginning. At first, there were only a few rooms and 3 patients. But word spread. People spoke of the woman who healed with love and the architect who built houses of hope. By the second year, the center had dozens of families and a garden blooming with lavender. And it was in that garden that Ethan proposed. The evening light filtered through the vines, just like the day they met. Grace was replanting a row of lavender pots when Ethan approached, a small box hidden in his hand. "Grace," he said softly. She turned, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "What is it, Ethan?" He looked at her for a long time. "I used to think love was just a scar from the past. But you taught me that love can be the start of something new." She laughed gently. "Ethan, you always know how to make people cry." He opened his hand. A simple silver ring lay there, glinting faintly in the light. "I can't promise perfection, but I can promise presence. I don't want to just work beside you. I want to live beside you." Tears filled her eyes. She nodded. "Yes, Ethan, I will." He smiled through tears, pulling her into his arms. Around them, the lavender swayed, petals spinning in the golden air, as if the world itself was blessing them. The wedding took place 2 weeks later, a small, tender ceremony in the very garden where it all began. Ella and Lila were flower girls, dressed in white with lavender crowns, giggling as they carried the rings. Grace walked down the lavender path, tulips in her hands. Ethan waited beneath the arbor, eyes shimmering. When she reached him, he took her hands and said, "Since the day you walked into my life, everything changed. You taught me that love isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering who we are." Grace smiled, tears gliding down her cheeks. And you taught me that no matter how broken we are, love can still grow. They exchanged vows, simple, honest. No grand orchestra, no fireworks, just wind, sunlight, and the laughter of two little girls echoing through the garden. Ella leaned toward Lila and whispered, "Daddy and Grace are married now, right?" Lila nodded. "Yes, we have a real family now." Ethan heard them, bent down and kissed their foreheads. Then he turned to Grace, squeezing her hand. "It took us years to find our way home, Grace," he said softly, "but we made it." And as the golden light wrapped around them, in the same garden where everything began, a new family was born, not perfect, but whole. The morning after the wedding, sunlight spilled through the lavender vines. Ella and Lila's laughter filled the garden as they scattered leftover petals from the night before. Ethan stood on the porch, coffee in hand, smiling at the simple, perfect beauty of it all. Grace stepped beside him, her hair loose in the breeze, one hand resting on her belly, a secret smile playing on her lips. He frowned softly. "You look different today. What's going on?" She placed his hand on her stomach. "Because someone's saying hello from here." Ethan froze, eyes widening, then glowing. He said nothing, just bent down and kissed her belly gently. "Noah," he whispered. "If it's a boy, I want to call him Noah." Grace laughed through tears. "Noah, peace after the storm. I love it." From that day on, their little house by the lavender garden became a true home. Every morning, Ethan made breakfast, Grace brewed tea, the twins doodled on the wooden table. Music played softly, the same melodies Grace once used for therapy sessions. Together, they practiced exercises with the girls. Lila could now run short distances, and Ella had begun to dance to the music. In the afternoons, when the sun dipped low, they spent time in the garden. Grace read while Ethan played ball with the kids, and in the breeze, the scent of lavender drifted, reminding them where it all began. Even as her belly grew, Grace never stopped working. Together, they wrote a book, a journal of their journey with Ella and Lila. Grace wrote with the heart of a mother. Ethan added sketches, photos, and notes filled with quiet emotion. The book, Small Steps of a Miracle, was published soon after Noah was born. It spread like wildfire. Families across the country wrote to thank them, saying it gave them hope, courage, and the will to try again. One morning, Ethan opened an email and read aloud, "My son hasn't walked in 3 years. After reading your story, I followed the exercises Grace described. Yesterday, he stood up for the first time. Thank you for giving us hope." Grace couldn't speak. She simply reached for his hand, eyes wet. They both knew this was more than success. It was purpose. Hope Valley grew. Ethan designed new therapy wings filled with sunlight and greenery. Grace trained young therapists in her philosophy. Lead with love, then teach with skill. Each day they arrived together. From his office, Ethan often watched her in the courtyard with the children, sunlight dancing on her hair. When Noah was born, the house glowed anew. He had his father's blue eyes and his mother's gentle smile. Ella and Lila hovered constantly by the crib, singing softly to their baby brother. The house was filled with laughter, baby babble, and the soft notes of the old piano Ethan played at night. One evening at sunset, Ethan placed their second manuscript on the table. "I think we should call this one The Miracle After the Storm," he said. Grace leaned against his shoulder, smiling. "Yes, because after all the storms, we finally found peace." He looked out at the lavender blooming once more, memories flickering like a slow film. The grief, the faith, the love that had carried them here. Turning back to her, he said quietly, "You know, happiness doesn't come from perfection. It comes from learning to love what's imperfect." She squeezed his hand gently. "And from never giving up on what we believe can still grow." The sunset bathed them in gold. Laughter rang out from the garden where Ella and Lila chased butterflies, while little Noah slept in Grace's arms, smiling in his dreams. Ethan kissed her hair, whispering, "We've come full circle." And in that moment, every sorrow, every loss, every broken dream dissolved into peace. The kind of happiness born not from perfection, but from patience, faith, and true love.